as you think about inflation, tightening labor supplies, tightening goods supplies, those pieces with a change in the working force, we're also then losing a big chunk of people that are buying less. How do those factors play into your view on the capabilities of the globe to handle whether it's inflation or demand?
On a global basis, you basically just put in a nutshell what the problem is. I mean, even if the United States decided it wanted to try to maintain the system, and I would argue that's beyond us, there aren't enough young people on a global basis to consume what global production capacity is at the moment. So this was always going to end this decade. Whether it's because there's a war or just a population bust, it really doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah. I saw your video, I think last week you were in Columbus.
That sounds right.
Doing a video about an Intel plant.
I travel a lot.
An Intel plant or something going up along the Ohio River. I grew up close to the Ohio River, and so know that waterway pretty well. But what is the U.S.'s capability, but also the political interest in becoming a manufacturing powerhouse again? I feel like we've got a lot of headwinds from whether it's policy or regulation that slow the development of manufacturing.
Well, something to keep in mind that of the first world countries, we have the lowest regulatory burden, bar none. And one of the advantages of being a federal system is you've got 50 different sets of policies, and you can mix and match and try different things. And so all 50 states are not going to double their industrial plant. No.
Just Texas.
Texas is probably going to triple. Northern Mexico is probably going to triple. Here, it's going to be a really squishy figure because so much of the tech sector is also in services, so it's kind of a hard measure. But different states are going to be able to take care of this at different angles. And if you're kind of looking for like the one thing to watch to determine if we can even try this, assuming the green transition stops today, assuming all we do is build out the industrial plant in order to produce our own manufactured goods, we need to increase electricity production in the United States by 50%. And if your community cannot get the extra power, then it's really hard for you to get into manufacturing. So there's going to be a lot of lead time here. I phrased that wrong. There's going to be a lot of leading indicators that tell us who is going to try to grab an outsized chunk of this.
I'm at heart an optimist, and I have a hard time with pessimism. I think it's too natural for us to go to a pessimistic scenario. In the book, we talk about, in the end of the world, you talk about failed states and widespread famine. The U.S. has got a more optimistic outlook, but parts of the world are very dire in your predictions. Tonight, in front of the Economic Club, if you'd like, I'm going to give you a chance to take it all back.
No. So when we think of globalization, we're usually thinking of transport and manufacturing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but every sector we have is globalized. And if you look at the original Green Revolution, lowercase g, the agricultural revolution of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was about bringing industrial inputs to lands that hadn't had them before, places that could not be major agricultural producers without synthetic fertilizers. The biggest beneficiary from that is Brazil. And the biggest provider of those things is Russia. And the biggest processor of these things is China. So it doesn't take any more than a mild case of deglobalization to break global agriculture in its current form. And there's no way you do that without losing 1 billion people. So the countries that are able to have an indigenous supply system for agriculture are largely exempt. The places that were producing food before 1950 because they had good land and good weather are largely exempt. And the U.S. is at the top of the list in both of those. We only import about 10% of our nitrogen fertilizer, only about 10% of our phosphate, and most of that comes from within the hemisphere. We do import 90% of our potash, but almost all of that comes from Canada. So, they are good for something. But those numbers are almost entirely flipped when you're looking at Australia or Brazil. So it's easy to massively increase your electricity production and then double the size of your industrial plant. That's the low-hanging fruit in the change that's coming. even if you're able to build out the replacement for the fertilizer and the transport system, you've still missed a half a dozen harvests. And that means you've lost a lot of people already.
So wouldn't it be logical to think that there would be some adaptations that we're missing here? That there would be a way to, as we're looking at failed states and widespread famine in China, having social unrest and upheaval, wouldn't an adaptation be like be deciding not to be so belligerent and to start play nice?
I don't know if China's capable of that now. I mean, it's one guy now. And he no longer has, I'm not saying there's not going to be a war in Taiwan. I don't know, because Xi hasn't decided. Fun little story. During the first month of the Ukraine war, when Putin was the one making all the nuclear threats personally, the U.S. ambassador was dispatched. And he basically said, I'm going to not tell you anything you don't know here. I'm just going to shine a light on what you do know from a different angle. It's like, you remember back 2 months ago when the day you decided when the war was going to start, what day it was going to be on, you were in that bunker under the Kremlin that was the safe in the safe in the safe. No one was taking notes because you didn't want anything to leak out. There no possibility of electronic eavesdropping. And do you remember how an hour after you left that bunker, we shared the full minutes of that meeting with the media? That was our way of telling you that we know exactly where you are at any moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen that come back are going to go absolutely anywhere but directly up your ass, you're out of your mind. So stop it. And he did. Now it's all his flunkies making the threats. The point is that Russia, despite its flaws, Putin, despite his flaws, he has an inner circle. He has people he trusts. He has people that he discusses things with. And so you can tap his phones. You can hack his emails. You can get an idea of what's going on within the Kremlin. You can't do that in Beijing because Xi speaks with no one. Now, 5 years ago, I knew for certain that the understanding of the Politburo was that a war for Taiwan, even if they could capture the place easily, wasn't going to solve anything for them. In fact, it would be the end of China's industrial experience, because China imports 80% of its energy and 80% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. So you put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, and it all shuts down. And you have a post-industrial collapse, complete with a famine in under 6 months, that within a couple of years probably kills half the population. They knew that. I don't know if they know that anymore. No one's certainly going to remind Xi of it. And so you've got this leader who is imbibing almost nothing but his own propaganda. The official strategic military plan for the PLA now, the People's Liberation Army, is Xi Jinping economic thought. He wrote a treatise on the role of military in society, and they now study that instead of doing proper wargaming. And so I can't tell you that there's going to be a kinder outcome here that's more based on compromise and reality, because Xi has made sure that he's not part of that reality. And that makes it unpredictable, but I don't think there's a lot of hope for kind of a nuanced negotiation here. You guys remember when Blinken went out in the aftermath of the balloon fiasco? He went so he could have a conversation with the foreign minister about how far up the information blackout went, and he found out that the foreign minister hadn't spoken to Xi in 4 months. This isn't a country anymore. This is just a march.
Well, at least we have living in the U.S. and in Colorado on our side. We got that going for us.
Yeah. Not suggesting we're the paragon of political discussion here, but at least we have a discussion.
Yeah.
Is that, Mark, I think your question was, or at least where Peter, you took it, was the unpredictability of some erratic leaders. And as I think about that, I think about our own erratic leaders, or the people at least in the roles. I'm not sure we can call them leaders, but their capability to, whether it's park a nuke up, Putin's ass, or park a destroyer in the South China Sea, and the wherewithal, political wherewithal, or trading power that they've got to be able to do that.
Well,
Is it there today?
I guess we have to talk about Biden.
We don't have to. We can
No,
talk
we
about
know,
the
that's
general
right. So-
DC.
Well,
swamp.
it's when it comes to foreign policy decision making, it's one guy. There's not an institution. There's a person. And Biden, from a foreign military strategic point of view, I think is kind of a B-rate president, which is the best we've had. Not Trump, not W, not Obama, not Clinton. Yeah, since Herbert Walker Bush. Definitely the best on security issues since Herbert Walker Bush. Admittedly, it's a low bar. And he's clearly losing his mind. Gives you an idea of how low the bar is. One of the beautiful things about having a president that's older than the pyramids is that he remembers the pyramids. He's seen the long run of history, and he's definitely a subscriber to the age-old American doctrine that our system is so stable that all we have to do is outweight them. And that's a correct assessment. Doesn't mean that we can't have better policy on a day-to-day basis. Definitely not saying that. On an economic point of view, oh my God, yeah, he's definitely in the bottom third. But so were the last 5. So, it's, again, low bar. Politically, what we are going through right now is every generation or two, the factions that make up our parties move around. It's a feature of our electoral laws. And eventually some jump ship, some switch sides. The factions rise and fall in power within the coalitions. And at the end of the process, you get 2 fundamentally new parties. This is the 6th time we've done this, and we are right in the middle of it right now. So the business community and the national security community have been kicked out of the Republican coalition, and the unions have left the Democratic coalition. And so if you're wondering why economic policy in Biden and Trump eras just makes no sense, that's because it makes no sense. Because the people who have been responsible for making economic policy in this country for the last 180 years, for the first time in 180 years, aren't even in the room. They're not allowed in the room. And you've got MAGA who thinks that the business community is part of the problem. And then you've got the Greens on the other side who want to punish the business community. And until such time as the unions or the business community or both end up in one or the other coalitions, this is just where we are. So this is definitely one of those times where, thank God, we're a federal system where the state and the local governments are responsible for most of the policies that affect us on a daily basis.
Well, let's look at geopolitical again. We've been hearing in the news about the axis of evil.
Yeah, it's back in vogue, isn't it?
Yeah. And we've certainly been reviving NATO and the idea of the Allies banding together. Does this have any potential for, realistic potential for another world war, given the alignments?
Probably not. What's going on in Gaza is a tempest in the teapot. The Israelis and Hezbollah have already made it clear that while they're with Hamas to the end, what the end means is the end of this press release. So there's not going to be any intervention there. And the Saudis have almost publicly come to the conclusion that they can't wait to restart negotiations with the Israelis on normalization. So Hamas and Gaza really are on their own. That doesn't mean I feel great about that, because the humanitarian tragedy that is unrolling here, so far the best estimate is we've only got 10,000, only have 10,000 dead Palestinians. I'm amazed that number is so low. 40% of the population has already evacuated Gaza City, which was the best infrastructure in the Strip. And so now we've got an area that has no food and no energy, and people living 3 people to a cot. Those numbers are going to skyrocket because it's going to take Israel at least a year to clear out Hamas. So this is going to get real ugly, but it's limited to Gaza. These people can't go anywhere. The Israelis would love if they all walked into the Sinai. And the Egyptians said that the only way they will allow that is if the world allows them to shoot every Palestinian as they leave Gaza. Yeah, people forget that the Egyptians used to control Gaza from 48 to 73, and, and no one had a good time. So this isn't going to spread. That doesn't mean it's great. It doesn't mean you should feel happy about it. It's just, it's not going to spread. The war of the day that matters is, of course, the Ukraine conflict. You guys remember in the opening days of the war, that giant convoy coming down from Belarus and how it stopped on the 4th day because the Russians forgot fuel? That's when we found out that the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war, or really any war. It's not an army that can't do combined arms, it's a mob with guns. But if there's anything we understand about the Russians is that they feel that in order to be secure, they have to limit the ability of outside powers to reach their space. And that means getting back to something roughly akin to the old Soviet boundaries. If they can do that, their total exposure to all international powers is only about 500 miles of territory that they have to block. Where they are now in post-Soviet Russia, there's over 3,500 miles. So they're right on the reading of the map. And so if they are able to overwhelm Ukraine, they will go for Poland, Romania, Latvia, and the rest of the eastern tier of NATO. And we will obliterate them in a conventional fight, because they clearly can't function in that way. And then the only tool they will have left will be nukes, and they will use them. So we have to keep the battle bottled up in Ukraine in order to not lose Chicago. And that's why the decision was made so firmly and so consistently and so early on providing the Ukrainians with absolutely anything that they can prove that they can use and maintain. The Germans were very, very clear on that. The Germans have gotten a lot of shit they don't deserve. They're like, if you cannot maintain the equipment we give you, we're giving you paperweights. Let's not waste anyone's time. Everything else is details. A lot of details. Anyway, that's a war that can escalate if it gets beyond Ukraine. And so that's critical. I don't know if I'd call it a world war, though. And then China is stewing in its own juices, and if there is a conflict as China falls, it'll be a naval one, and will be one they're going to lose in a matter of weeks, if not days, because they can't project. They have a lot of ships, but only about 10% of their fleet can sail more than 400 miles from land in a combat scenario. And the only ports that they have beyond the Chinese mainland, they rely on American naval cover to reach. They're like Djibouti, wouldn't help in a war at all. So yeah, I'm really not concerned about the Chinese fall from a military point of view unless Xi just gets some wild-ass hair. Just keep in mind that the degradation in decision-making that we've seen across the Chinese system applies to the military too. And how do you fight a war if no one can make a decision?
Well, that almost sounds optimistic.
It's like I don't want to overplay it because it's become a black box because of how Xi has structured the thing. That doesn't mean there can't be a war. I'm just saying that if there is a war, I doubt the Chinese are going to do nearly as well as a lot of people think.
But they've got how many millions of troops?
Yeah, but
if it's a ground war?
If they go into Vietnam, they're going to be treated with the same gentle fury that they were the last time they went. They went right after we were in Vietnam, and they had just as much fun as we did. India's on the wrong side of the Himalayas. Can't cross. Kazakhstan. What does the winner get? Siberia. The Russians made it very clear under Yeltsin, a policy that has not been updated under Putin, that we won't try to meet you with tanks and troops. We'll just nuke you. That leaves the ocean, and that means they have to swim. China can die in a box. It's entirely possible. It's happened many times in history before. The difference this time is that they've urbanized everyone, destroyed most of their farmland, and they have no replacement generation. So this really is the final generation of the Chinese existence. This is the end. It's just a question of how they go out.
And what does it look like at that point? Is it a regional, tribal kind of a...
It's a possibility. I mean, this will be, I think, I have to go back and get this number for sure. I think it's the 27th time that civilization has collapsed in China. This is not new. The whole over-centralization versus spin-out is the cycle we see over and over and over. If I was to guess, because of the over-urbanization, because of their dependence on foreign inputs to keep their population alive, I would guess that the northern section, which you can reach on horseback if you need to, will kind of fall in on itself and implode and have the worst famine in the human experience that'll kill at least half the population within a decade. and kind of falls into a neo-warlordism, neo-Maoist tyranny of just the southern cities from Shanghai to Guangzhou will probably go their own way. Historically speaking, that's how it's always worked. And historically speaking, they've gotten the majority of their foodstuffs from not mainland Asia. It's a model that works, and maybe it'll work again. And then the interior, Tibet and Xinjiang. I know that a lot of people like to romanticize the people who live on horses in the plains, but do we not remember the Mongol Empire? These are not nice people. They don't normally hang out in airports with saffron robes and smiles. There's a reason that the Chinese treat them so badly. And as soon as that noose is off of their neck, oh my God, the bloodletting that will happen. That's a problem for another day, though.
You talk about the potential inward collapse there in China, but to me, I would think you've got, 30-odd provinces in China that
Give or take.
all have their own little kings. And
Not anymore. Xi killed them all.
He killed them all. Okay. They were too corrupt.
Yeah, so, well, we had a 10-year anti-corruption program. The first 5 years, he got rid of all the regional leaders. The next 5 years, he gutted the two factions that put him in place. You guys remember Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, the former presidents? Those factions. You remember how last year, when Xi anointed himself president for life, how he physically dragged Hu Jintao off the stage on live television? Yeah. That was glorious. Oh my God. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was horrible for Hu, but he was kind of a jerk. It's now just Xi. He spent the last 3 years going after business and academia.
Right. Sorry, Mark.
Well, I was just going to, again, try to pivot towards optimism. Who do you think is going to be the winner besides the United States in this new global order and after deglobalization? What countries that maybe haven't been reaching their full potential in the current environment will thrive?
I can break them into three categories, which there's some overlap. So the first are the countries that globalization was kind of a raw deal for them. They have good geographies. They have the ability to defend themselves. They have a military that's right-sized to their needs. They're not dependent on international trade, never have been. But under globalization, everyone else rose up, and the United States' backing of globalization meant that their good geographies didn't matter for 75 years. Now they will again. Japan, Turkey, and France are the big three. The Japanese, by the way, have cut a deal with both Trump and Biden. They're the only people who see this coming, and they've gotten ahead of it. So good for the Japanese. France will be its own way, but we're going to be siblings with all the arguments over pointless things that siblings have. But at the end, we'll have our back on anything that matters, and then Turkey is absolutely going its own way. Argentina falls into that category if they can figure out how to get their heads out of their asses.
Any positives in Africa?
Africa's a weird one.
You don't seem to talk about the continent.
Well,
much.
yeah, the issue is that the geography is really, really hostile to integration and infrastructure.
Yeah.
You've got jungles, you've got deserts, you've got a series of stacked plateaus.
The Chinese have put a ton of money into Africa.
Right, but that's basically capital flight. That doesn't count. The African growth story of the last 15 years, to be perfectly blunt, is boomer capital. It's been a consumption boom. They've been borrowing. It's a Greece story. And now that the capital is more expensive, it's already over. Now, there are little pockets around the edges where the population can integrate because it's flat and they have decent access to the sea, and these zones can participate in whatever's next. That's like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Angola, probably Senegal. And those zones have an interesting future, I think, but the rest of it does not look good. Anyway, number one, the ones that had good geography before, that will matter again. Number two, the ones who have association with the United States for whatever reason, Canada and Mexico being at the top of that list. And the third one being places where the geography would normally argue against them being successful, but it also means they're insulated from what's about to happen, and I think primarily about Southeast Asia in that regard, because they've never really had a regional war because they couldn't get at each other through the mountains and the jungles. So you kind of have a mini globalization happening in Southeast Asia, and then a degree of partnership within the Western Hemisphere with the Japanese kind of hand-holding among those three groups.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's still a pretty good story.
Well, Courtney is telling me it's time for questions from you all, and
She's
we've
so
got,
bossy.
She is. She needs a big clock though, because we don't stay on track ever. Courtney, where would you like to go first?
We're going to go right here.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for the talk. I'm aware that two of your favorite English language news sources are Al Jazeera for anything that doesn't involve the Middle East and France 24.
For anything that doesn't involve Europe.
For anything, yeah. Also, I've gotten some great people to follow on Twitter or X by looking at your account. I would love to leave with some news sources. You are a top follow for me, or a must watch, right? Mm-hmm. Your newsletter and the videos. What news sources do you think do the best job of doing an analysis rather than a day-to-day like Al Jazeera or France 24?
Yeah, France 24 and Al Jazeera are your good sources for, like you said, day-to-day awareness. For analysis, whew. The Economist, but 2/3 of the way through any article, just stop. The last third is their prescription for a world that will never happen. But they have really good awareness in every country that matters and on almost every issue that matters. Just when they start to get preachy, I just kind of tune out. Wall Street Journal is the best in the world at what it does. Just keep in mind that what it does is relatively narrow. Beyond that, it sucks. Over the last 20 years, technology has outpaced the ability of news organizations to adapt their models. And until such time as we find a more productive way to limit social media, I don't think it's going to come back. Now, we will get there. This isn't the first time we've been here. When the Telegraph came out, we had yellow journalism, which was literally people making shit up about whatever they wanted. It was very social media of the day. And it took a couple decades for us to get libel laws. So we need to reform the 1996 Telecommunications Act. That's the one that means that no matter what you post on whatever forum, neither you or the forum are liable for anything. And if we can find a way to amend that, to have a more constructive conversation, then all of a sudden media can be back in business at every level. But until that happens, the lies are seductive, they're popular, and the business model for the old media just doesn't work. Because, I don't even have a television. Am I the only one here? I see lots of naughty millennials. Okay, it's not just me.
We have another over here, Peter.
Because every time I've heard you talk about the Jones Act, I know. I was wondering if you could do me a solid and just steelman the argument, however idiotic you might find it, about why someone would think it's a good idea to have it keep going. And then my other question I wanted to squeeze in is, Congress right now is trying to squeeze Ukraine aid, Israel aid, and the smorgasbord of fights that are going on about how much. Where do you see that going in terms of American commitment as domestic politics keep firing up? We have rallies and riots all the time about helping people, but here we are spending $100 billion plus on Ukraine aid. Where do you see that going in the future? Do you think the American public is going to continue stomaching foreign aid?
The American public is wildly misinformed about the reality of the situation. The aid to Israel to this point is very thin because the Congress hasn't acted yet. And the aid to Ukraine is over 90% used equipment that was slated for destruction. So honestly, the Ukrainians, from a financial point of view, are doing us a solid.
It's probably destroyed by now.
Yeah. So it's like just the countries that have sent cash to Ukraine are primarily European. And by the way, the Europeans for the last 4 months have sent more in total value of stuff to the Ukrainians than we have. So again, the story is because that people have a benefit they perceive in basically lying to everybody on a regular basis. So, I mean, you're still asking the right question, what will people tolerate, but people don't understand what they're tolerating. I mean, our financial contribution to the Ukrainians is negligible. To your earlier question, Jones Act, it's really very simple. The jobs in the domestic shipbuilding and management industry are 100% unionized. And the unions have left the Democratic coalition. And we need to double the size of the industrial plant. How many of those jobs do you think are blue collar? So we're at the start of the greatest run of organized labor in this country's history. And no one in Washington wants to piss them off.
Even more than 30s.
Much more.
Got a couple down front, Courtney. Okay.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So in reading your book, listening to some of your podcasts, I think one of the things that you do that is part of what makes you so interesting is you follow these trends, whether they're demographic or economic, to their logical conclusion. But in reality, there seems to be a lot of other things that come into play, whether that's substitution, new technologies, new trading blocks, all sorts of things. And what I found in kind of your book was that you followed kind of the current paths down their logical conclusions. I'm curious where you see places where you think there's a big margin of error in your analysis and conclusion, or where you think that, you know, certain countries or geographies might actually have a chance to really change what seems like the logical conclusion that they're leading to.
Yeah, I would argue that any futurist is going to have some version of that issue, because you've got to choose the things that you think are going to change the trajectory versus the things that aren't. I think one of the reasons why I'm in a better position than most is because I do so much with demographics. And if you want to move the demographic profile, you have to start decades in the past. And until we figure out either mass cloning, Star Wars style, they have to like come out of the box with skills, or time machine. We're kind of locked in to those forecasts. Geopolitics a little bit different. Individual decisions do matter, and every once in a while we do get a leader who twists history. I don't think Biden's that person. I think Trump was, and I think Trump sped it up. The challenge in what I do is figuring out what to ignore, and that's where technology gets really, really tricky. Because if we figure out a new battery chemistry, for example, then all of a sudden the green revolution goes from this weird, expensive waste of time to something that really can change the human condition. It just takes that one thing. Now, we don't have anything that's even at the prototype stage, and today, the next generation of nuclear reactor was canceled. So even my backup plan for what the green transition might involve has now fallen through. But the problem with technology in general is it requires two things to move at pace. You need a lot of capital to pay for it, and you need a lot of young people who are wired together to imagine the future. Well, the millennials are getting too old, and the capital is now gone. If technology can't at scale be part of the problem, we have to deal with the tools that we have now, or rely on specific leaders to take us down a different path.
And Wakanda?
That would be awesome. Just throw some vibranium at it.
Hey, Peter. Question is about U.S. national debt.
Oh, boy.
So there is a lot of talk about the boogeyman there. Maybe give you a little bit of the perspective there. Did inflation help out with devaluing that debt?
No.
Where you see that going?
Up.
Does it scare you?
A little.
How do we manage that?
We don't.
Hyperinflation?
No. Okay, so next year it looks like we're going to have $1 trillion in interest payments. That's a big number. That's significantly more than defense. But I still don't overly worry about it. So a couple things. Number one, the Japanese have shown us that even with an egregious level of debt, a first world country that keeps most of it domestic can manage just fine. So if you include their pension arrears, they're at 500% of GDP now. So we can quadruple our debt level before we get into something that might push the envelope. This is not a recommendation.
500%.
Yeah, 500% of GDP.
That's not pushing the envelope.
From a national coherence point of view, no. I'm not saying there's not an opportunity cost.
Yeah.
If we had stuck with the Clinton program from 35 years ago, or however long it's been, we would have paid the debt down to zero. We would have already paid for the retirement of the baby boomers. We would have in a very different macroeconomic environment. And as a fiscal conservative, I would have loved that. We made different choices. A series of bipartisan presidents made very different choices. We forget often that it's not one party or the other. W set the record in the post-war era for deficits. Obama said, hold my beer, and he doubled it. Trump came in, he's like, I'm going to make it huge. And then we have Biden, who is on track to double it again. This is across the parties. However, we're the global currency, and there's no pretender to the throne. At the BRICS summit in South Africa, the Chinese, the Indians, and the South Africans said they had no interest in a non-US dollar-denominated world. None. Wasn't picked up here because that didn't match the de-dollarization mantra that is going around. But in the rest of the world, the only country that really wants to move beyond the dollar is Russia, and they just want everyone to use the ruble.
No, Chinese. Chinese don't live.
The Chinese don't. No, they're very happy with the dollar. As long as that's the case, we can do things with our currency that no one else could do, and that includes monetization. Now, again, this is not a recommendation, but the first roughly $800 billion of deficit spending, as a percentage of GDP, that's right at our average growth rate for the last 50 years. So that's kind of free, if you will. And we can go up to 500% of GDP. So at the current rate that the debt is increasing, we still have at least another century and a half.
Covers me.
Well, I mean, again, this is not my recommendation. The opportunity cost is significant, but we're not staring down a monster here, at least not for a few decades. And keep in mind that everyone else is in such a worse position because we have, again, the millennials, or as I like to think of them, the taxpayers of tomorrow.
Checkbooks.
Peter, Leo Tillman, thank you for the talk. One of the most fascinating talks I've heard in quite some time.
Thanks.
What is the scenario where Russia expands beyond Ukraine?
The list of countries that they feel they need to dominate in order to get what they feel they need. And by the way, this is the 9th post-Soviet war, not the first. So there's a pattern here. If you think you can just give the Russians some land and they'll stop, you clearly don't know recent history. In no particular order, Moldova, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Romania, parts of Poland, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan for sure, probably Uzbekistan as well. The Putin plan for the first 2 decades of his reign, feels weird saying that, was that all we have to do is make sure that the West isn't present and that we control the top-level elite so that we can have this as a buffer that we control, but we don't necessarily have to occupy. And what they've discovered in the last 10 years is that doesn't work. Because if you have a cozy, corrupt elite that's beholden to the Kremlin, that generates resentment, even if no one on the outside is manipulating events. And one of the things that deglobalization is bringing us is other people manipulating events. It used to be during the Cold War that if an ally started mucking around with Soviet interests, we brought the hammer down on them. Because nuclear war is the risk, and if there was going to be an escalation, we wanted to make sure we had that on a very tight leash. With the United States stepping back, all of a sudden everyone else is doing things on their own. And one of the things that the Russians are having difficulty processing is the most aggressive supporters of Ukraine aren't American. They're Polish, they're British, they're French. Oh my God, the French are in the game again. It's so much fun to watch. But there's now 50 capitals, including the Australians, who just don't want to feel left out, who are playing very, very actively across the former Soviet space. And there's very little effort from the United States to ride herd on this because Biden can only focus on so many things at a time. And I don't mean that as a slam on Biden. That's just the nature of the world that we're in now. And that means that The Russians' only option is direct control. And so it's an occupation, it's a deliberate genocide to whittle down the numbers. Go ahead.
Talk to us a little bit about California.
What are you after?
You know, on its progression, right? I mean, it really dominated U.S. economic sort of momentum for 50, 60 years.
Okay, well, think about the environment we've been in for the last 40 years. We've had the baby boomers, at the peak of their consumption, then moving into the peak of their investment. And those two trends dominated a lot of American economic patterns, especially in California. California before the 80s was kind of backwards, wasn't in the top tier, certainly didn't have Silicon Valley. They had an agricultural system that was, because they just couldn't compete with the Midwest or the general South. But with globalization and with the baby boomers turning into capital providers, that shifted. Globalization set the East Asian Rim on fire from a growth point of view. And a lot of manufacturing moved there. But Americans still wanted stuff, so we imported largely through the West Coast. And so that's the Long Beach story. That's at least a third of the LA story. That's part of the Tacoma story and the Seattle story. Second, all of this capital combined with millennials seeking their urban experience. That's the Silicon Valley story. And so we had this weird transformation where manufacturing left, but processing of manufactured goods became huge. The agriculture changed because instead of them producing beef and wheat and rice, they sold to the price-insensitive Chinese and produced cherries and pistachios, products with very, very, very high margins, environmentally devastating, but California's not consistent, but made a huge amount of money for the valley. And then Silicon Valley would do the programming and the design of systems to help digitize and, dematerialize a lot of productive processes. And so that hurt a lot of the United States, especially the old steel belt. But the people who managed that process and developed that process in California did very, very, very well for themselves. So California went higher and higher and higher up the value-added chain in a number of industries. Well, that trend's over. The number one source of population growth, number one and number two for the last 30 years has been migration from the South, that's now negative, or migration of millennials in, that's now negative. The capital's no longer there. And when China breaks, that's the last of those three big trends that created the California we now know. And they'll be left with regulation. That's not enough to run a system on. So they're going to have to reinvent themselves. Now, they've done it before. I have full confidence they can do it again. The question is, how long is it going to take them? I would say more than 5 years. And in that time, California becomes the sick man of the United States.
Hello.
Hi.
So a question I've had, we've talked a lot about Ukraine and we've talked a lot about Russia and both sides needing to win that conflict.
Technically, we just need to not lose, but I follow you.
You're right. They need to not lose. So how does this play out? I've listened to a lot of the things you've said over the years that have kind of come to fruition, but how do you see this conflict playing out? And hopefully it's an answer that doesn't include the nukes.
Anyone who feels that they've got a good grip on where this is going is not being honest with themselves. Everyone's assessments, my own included, were proven wrong in the first week of the war and then the first month of the war and certainly by the end of the summer. That the Russians could botch it so completely that the Ukrainians with nothing more than a few jeeps could have 2 lightning counteroffensives that would just regain so much territory so quickly. Oh my God. And then now the Russians have rediscovered how to fight a defensive war, so they can be taught. It's up in the air. There's 2 ways this can go, in my opinion. Whether or not it goes quickly or slowly, I don't know. Number one, they eventually do overwhelm Ukraine, the Russians. If they do that, it will be because the West loses the ability to supply them with equipment for political or more likely for material weapons or material reasons. Our ability to manufacture what they need is limited. And once we get through all of those back stocks, we will have the choice between giving them our mainland stuff or very little. We're not going to hit that this year. We're not going to hit that next year, but probably the year after. They are spinning up. We are spinning up what we can produce, but it takes time. The Russians are spinning up faster, and their tolerance for pain is much higher, and that's before you consider their ability to, say, bring in stuff from China or Iran or North Korea or wherever else. Those all come with their own ifs, ands, and buts, but it's a more reliable product stream than what we can do in the long run. And then if we do get to Poland, where we are forced into a direct fight, we will have nukes fly, and that's one of the reasons why the Biden administration is pulling out all the stops on missile defense. There's a fear we're going to need it. Second scenario is the Ukrainians win. But even if they purge the Russians from all of their pre-war territories, that's not enough. The Russians know that if they lose this, they cease to exist as a coherent country in under 2 decades. And so they're going to try again and again and again, as long as they can. And so for the Ukrainians to prevent that from happening, they will have to cross into Russia proper and neutralize a couple of major logistics hubs. That's an invasion of the motherland. That would justify nuclear use too. So we're in this really weird-ass, unfortunate situation where the best case for us is to fight to the last Ukrainian within Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians I've talked to in the government, they're fine with that because they know the alternative is to die to the last Ukraine at Russian hands without weapons and the ability to fight back. And for them, there's no choice here. I would love for there to be a third way. I don't think there is.
Got a question. Courtney, how much time do we have?
Yep. Yikes. I don't want to follow that. That's
Okay.
It's pretty dire. So, thanks for giving us a lot to think about, Peter. So, two-part question. There's a lot of headwinds out there, obviously, that you've identified globally. And there's a lot of countries. You haven't mentioned the recession word. Is that coming? And it's in Germany. It's in a lot of parts of the world now. Is that where the U.S. is heading? And then second part, how do we trade this? You've got a lot of ideas. We're all capitalists at the end of the day. So next 2 years, what are you short and what are you long?
I don't play the short game.
Well, not companies. I just mean countries and industries. And
let me do the second one first. I'll just tell you what I do. I'm very bullish on the United States in general, but I also have a very good appreciation for the countries that are going to help us turn the page historically. The problem is that most of them, like Mexico, don't really have functional capital markets. So I like U.S. large and mid cap in manufacturing, more and more small cap. I like companies that are energy intensive in their operation because we have the cheapest electricity and chemicals and oil on the planet. I like companies where the demand for their product is demographically driven because we have the healthiest demography in the rich world and Mexico has the healthiest demography in the advanced developing world. And if that end product is also exportable, I really like it because that means that we've got competition around the world that's going to be falling and they're going to need this stuff. So I like chemicals, I like refining, I like food processing, and I like anything that deals with urbanization in the United States because we have so much population movement internally that U of cities all need to expand their physical footprint. So that's what I do. What was the first question? Recession. I don't know. I understand why people think that there might be a recession imminent. I understand why people have been thinking that for over a year. I don't know. We're in such a weird place, historically speaking, that the normal supply-demand trends don't line up in a way that they have before. I mean, I understand why inflation's high, but we need to expand so much in terms of industrial infrastructure that it's going to overwhelm a lot of the normal activity that we see. And the combined consumer base in the United States still has $1 trillion of cash, and we're still an economy that's 2/3 driven by consumption. So it doesn't feel to me like a recession is preordained, even though I understand all the warning signals, whether it's the yield curve or inflation or something else. I get it, I understand. Something, though, that you have to increasingly take into account, especially when you're looking beyond the United States, every economic theory we have, every economic indicator we follow is predicated on a relatively stable relationship among capital, labor, supply, and demand. And when you flip the demographic pyramid, none of it makes sense anymore. So outside of the US, these measures are going to become increasingly useless. And even in the United States, we're still aging. So the relationships aren't going to be as firm as they used to be. That's going to make your job harder. But it's going to make foreign direct investment really interesting.
Just curious to know, you haven't talked about AI.
Okay.
And I'm just curious to know what your thoughts on that as a shock to the system.
Sure. So let me give you the good and the bad. First, the good, so I can end where I'm more comfortable. I, as a rule, don't bet on technology solving our problems because there's a time horizon. You have to get to a certain point in development before it can be applied at scale and solve the problem. And if you had asked me 18 months ago if I thought AI was going to make it, I would have said no. I mean, yes, they can recognize cats in videos. The economic case for that is somewhat limited. ChatGPT, when it came out a few months ago, partially changed my mind. This is something that's like right at the tipping point now. And that's really interesting to me. However, the ecosystem to produce the sub-4 nanometer chips that are necessary for AI to work is the most vulnerable industrial process we have on this planet. 90% of the chips are made in one town in Taiwan, and the fabrication facilities that allow those the supply chain that allows those fabrication facilities to function is fully global, and half of that supply chain only produces one product, half of the companies in that supply chain only provide one product for one customer with no competition anywhere in the world. A single country, doesn't matter which one really, falls out of the constellation and the fabrication stops. So we're in this race right now. Can we produce enough of the high-end chips before that system goes down in order to apply AI? And will we have enough that AI can manifest everything that we hope it can do this decade? And I don't think we can. We're going to be able to apply it to maybe one or two things. Is that agriculture, so we save 1 billion lives? Is that defense? Is it finance? Is it automation? We're going to have to decide that as a society and as a government. But every day that these facilities keep running is just a little bit more of capacity that we can throw at things. If I were a betting man, I would guess that it would go to defense and agriculture, just playing the numbers. But that would require very, very firm government hand in that decision making. Because we all know that you guys are going to use it for stock trading.
So you're really between whether it's the chips or the manufacturing boom in the U.S., back to Mr. Zollner's question, is you're talking about a super cycle in commodities.
I was waiting for the question, I'm sorry.
You're talking about a commodity boom, how to trade it.
Oh God, no. I am providing no advice on that. Yeah, no. It's like commodities are going to be a mess, especially industrial commodities.
Because of supply chains.
Well, for industrial commodities, the mines are in one place, the processing in another place, the value add into components is in a third place, and the market's in a fourth.
Yeah.
That's easy to break, especially since most of the processing's in China.
Right.
So that processing has got to be part of our industrial build-out.
Does that kill the green revolution too?
That's one of the many things that's going to kill the green revolution.
Okay. Sorry, Courtney.
Okay, we're going to do one last question and then wrap it up.
Oh, make it awkward.
You came to the right place.
Oh, yeah.
One of the most provocative things you said that I think has been kind of glossed over was a claim around kind of some pretty extreme inflation.
Okay.
I think is really connected to deglobalization and kind of nearshoring or kind of bringing manufacturing back and that causing inflation.
Throw some demographics in there too.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I'm curious about, and I guess from your comments before, you're kind of overlooking the debt challenge and things like that, or I don't know if overlooking, but you're taking that as something we can just handle. But
no, I folded in. I mean, we have to do this industrial build-out in a time of limited labor and capital. That's inflation.
So I guess the basis of my question then is that in a world in which we have shrinking demographics, which require more stimulus in order to sustain our growth, in a world in which we have huge debt built up, whereas we have high interest rates, that sinks the rest of our economy. How do we realistically?
I disagree with that last statement.
Okay.
We are perfectly capable of having high interest, high inflation, high growth all at the same time.
How do you think we handle, though, a high inflation, high interest rate type of world, given demographic challenges that we're maybe better suited than most for, but still have our challenges, and also with a huge debt load, that if we load up high inflation, it's going to necessarily lead to high interest rates? How can those things coexist in a way that doesn't collapse the system?
Think of the 1970s, but with growth that is 4 times as high. Not stagflation, hyper growth at the same time we have, not hyperinflation, but very high inflation. And when you do that, the winners and the losers in the economic and the political system get thrown into a blender, and a different society comes out on the other side. The fact that we're going through a political transition at the same time, honestly, we're a little fortunate, because the things that were already broken politically, we're not going to miss. Now, whether it'll look better on the other side from any of your point of view, I don't know. I'm just telling you it's going to be very, very different. The power centers, politically and economically, 10 years from now, are going to be radically different than what we've become used to for the last 50 years. So you're looking at full societal transformation. I don't know how that's going to shake out yet. If I did, I would tell you.
Great.
Thank you, Peter.
Just keep in mind, we've been through this 6 times before. We will get through it.
Memories are short, right?
Well, it's been a while.
Never as good as you think it is or as bad as you think it is. Or will be.
It's going to be a wild ride. Already is.
Well, it's been a wild discussion and wide-ranging, as expected. Lots to think about, and thanks so much for staying the full duration, keeping it
I live
interesting.
here. I don't have to catch a flight. This is great.
And thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a real enjoyable evening, and I hope everybody's leaving with a good takeaway and something to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to underline, this is a good story. This is the fastest growth, not in our lifetimes, in our country's history. This is great. Just...
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.